My talk today is entitled Individuals versus Groups in Evolutionary Biology, and is a project that lies at the interface of philosophy of science and evolutionary theory, and also draws on some ideas from economics. So the themes of my talk today are firstly, hierarchy in the biological world. This refers to the fact that the biological entities, the entities that biologists study, form a kind of nested hierarchy, a fairly familiar observation, with multicelled organisms like ourselves being located sort of somewhere near the middle of the hierarchy. More on that in a moment. Secondly, the tension between individual and group interests. So I use individual and group here in generic senses. So what's an individual in one context might be a group in another. So we're individuals relative to social groups, but obviously our bodies are composed of cells. So individuals can also be thought of as groups via a sort of frame shift in perspective. Thirdly, conflict versus cooperation in evolutionary biology. And fourthly, this issue of levels of selection in evolution, the age-old discussion of whether we should think of adaptation as occurring primarily at the individual level, whatever that means, or versus other potential alternatives. Okay, so all of those four things are central themes in the area known as social evolution theory, which describes natural selection in social settings. That's to say, in settings where the phenotypes expressed by the organisms affect not only their own reproductive prospects, but also those of other conspecifics, typically who they interact with, which leads naturally to consideration of the evolution of social behaviors, but behaviors that affect not only oneself, but also those of others. I think of this as both a fascinating branch of evolutionary biology in its own right, and also something that has implications for philosophy and for social science more broadly. However, it's an area that's beset by kind of conceptual problems and an intermingling of empirical and conceptual issues, and so requires careful philosophical scrutiny. Okay, I'll start with a fairly familiar topic that many of you will know about, the so-called puzzle of altruism, which refers to the problem of understanding how it is that altruistic behaviors can evolve by natural selection, where an altruistic behavior is one that an animal or organism performs which imposes a cost on itself but benefits other members of its population. And at first blush you might think, well, surely natural selection should disfavor such behaviors. I mean, after all, Darwinism leads us to expect organisms to look out for their own reproductive interests, not those of others. And yet altruism is quite common in nature. So, for example, vampire bats, an old and well-known example, need regular blood if they're going to survive. They have to feed every 2 days or else they're going to die. And observations show clearly that vampire bats regurgitate blood to feed others, typically non-relatives, members of their groups, on those occasions when other people have failed to feed and are in danger of death. And such an action appears to be altruistic at first blush. Another familiar example, in honeybee colonies, then we find the vast majority of the bees making up a colony are sterile workers who have taken altruism to a sort of extreme limit, if you like, in that they don't leave any offspring of their own, but devote their whole lives towards tending the larva, collecting food, protecting the hive, and so assisting the reproductive efforts of the queen. It's an extreme of altruism, and you find the same thing in many other social insect species. Same phenomenon you find at the microbial level. This is a more recent and active area of research. So in this species of bacteria, a member of the Pseudomonas group, then we find a type of altruistic behavior in that these bacteria produce siderophores, which are agents that they release into the environment in response to iron deficiency, that free up host-bound iron and enable the bacteria to metabolize it. I mean, the mechanical details don't matter. The key point is that producing siderophores is a public good, because you release it into the environment, it benefits others. So it raises the same question: why do they bother doing it? Why not just wait for someone else to do it? I mean, surely that would be the rational strategy if you're a cunning, calculating bacterium. That would be the thing to do. This problem was appreciated by Darwin himself in a number of places. So in The Descent of Man, his application of his evolutionary ideas to humans, Darwin discussed the origin of prosocial tendencies in early hominids. He was particularly interested in the fact, or the alleged fact, that self-sacrificial behaviors were common among early hominids, in which they'd sacrifice themselves for the good of their tribe or their group. And Darwin wrote, "He who was ready to sacrifice his life rather than betray his comrades would often leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature." So there Darwin's expressing his awareness of this problem of understanding how self-sacrificial, other-regarding behaviors could evolve by natural selection. And interestingly, Darwin continued, as a qualitative solution to this problem that he's identified, he continued his reasoning as follows. He said, having laid out the problem, how difficult it is for natural selection to favor something like self-sacrifice, Darwin says, however, a tribe including many members who are always ready to sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection. So interestingly, what Darwin is suggesting is that if you adopt the hypothesis of natural selection, not just individual against individual, but thinking of selection operating at the group or tribe level, favoring some tribes over others, then the behavior that seemed anomalous or individually disadvantageous might be advantageous at the group level. And that's the first application of what's sometimes called group selection thinking in evolutionary biology, invoking the principle of natural selection at the group level, where the behaviors that we expect therefore to see evolving are group beneficial rather than individually beneficial ones. And we can illustrate schematically Darwin's reasoning as follows. So here these big green circles are groups. The dots within them are individuals. And individuals are of two types: selfish ones who'll never sacrifice, the yellow ones who'll never sacrifice themselves for their tribe, and red ones who will, the altruistic types. And then Darwin's first observation is that if you look at any one group, right, then clearly the yellow ones will be at a relative advantage compared to red ones within the same group. They'll free ride on the others' altruistic tendencies without having to pay any of the cost. That's the problem. But then Darwin's observation is that if you think at the between group level, then it may be that groups such as this, predominantly selfish, fare much better than groups such as this, predominantly altruistic, even though within any of the two groups, within any single group, the yellow selfish types outperform the red types. So in essence, the idea is that there's a balance between the two selective forces and that the net outcome is going to depend on them both. And obviously, when phrased like that, you can see that it cries out for mathematical analysis, the problem, which it wasn't to receive until the 1960s. And work then broadly confirms Darwin's basic intuition that this process of selection operating between groups can, in principle, in some circumstances, lead to behaviors that are individually disadvantageous but group beneficial evolving. And this then leads to the more general so-called levels of selection question in evolutionary biology, which asks what level of the biological hierarchy natural selection acts at. And the question derives its force from two observations. Firstly, the fact of hierarchical organization in the biological world, and secondly, the abstractness of the basic Darwinian logic, of the basic principles Darwin outlined. And so to see, it's the interaction of these 2 points that generates the levels of selection question. To take the second one first, consider the basic Darwinian logic. Stripped of all the bells and whistles, what do Darwin's arguments in The Origin of Species amount to? Well, really simply this. He said, look, suppose a population of entities exhibits firstly variation, they're not all alike, there are different types in the population. Secondly, fitness differences, some types are fitter or more reproductively successful than other types, perhaps because they survive better, perhaps because they're better at getting mates, whatever. And thirdly, suppose that type is heritable, that the fitter types tend to transmit their phenotype faithfully to the next generation. So there's a parent-offspring correlation with respect to type. Then, Darwin said, the population will evolve, where evolve just means its composition will change over time. And the key point is that the basic logic can be spelled out without saying what those entities in the population are, by just using that abstract placeholder entity. And we can depict Darwin's reasoning by simply imagining a population composed of a number of different types, the different coloured dots, pre-selection, and then here, after a round of reproduction has taken place, the descendant population, as we see, the relative frequencies of the different colours of dots has changed. And that's all Darwin's argument amounts to. So that's point number one, the abstractness of the Darwinian principles. Point number two is the fact of hierarchical organisation in the biological world. So typically discussions of this point will say things like this. They'll say, well, look, genes form chromosomes, so many genes found on a single chromosome, many chromosomes found in a single cell. Cells go to make up tissues and organisms, and multi-celled organisms. Multi-celled organisms sometimes form themselves into social groups or colonies of varying sorts. Above the level of colony, we find entities such as species and perhaps whole ecosystems. Now, I mean, it's far from obvious, in my opinion, how exactly to characterize this in a logically consistent way and what the criteria for entry, for constituting a level in this hierarchy are. But nonetheless, it's clear that the notion of reproduction or fitness applies at many different levels of the biological hierarchy. I mean, genes make more genes, chromosomes make other chromosomes, cells make other cells. Maybe not these two. Multi-celled organisms obviously reproduce. Insect colonies reproduce too. Species split, leave other species, and so on. So the basic Darwinian concept of fitness can, in principle, apply up and down the hierarchy. And so that generates then the question, well, what are these entities on which natural selection is acting, the so-called levels of selection question? Now, the consensus in the 1960s and 70s on this point was that group selection is basically a minor factor from the mid-1960s onwards. This tended to be the viewpoint among most evolutionists. They said, well, group selection is a relatively minor factor, and the existence of phenomena like altruism, which appear inexplicable from the individual point of view, are explicable in other ways. So this slogan became then that individual selection is all that matters in practice, whatever about other theoretical possibilities. So the suggestion was then that proponents of group selection had advanced either what was an empirically unnecessary hypothesis, or in some versions of the critique had committed a kind of logical error. And the source of this consensus is multifaceted. I mean, part of it comes from Hamilton's famous work on kin selection theory, although ironically he himself had rather ambivalent views about the hypothesis of group selection. But people influenced by his kin selection theory, that's the theory that says that evolution of social behavior is generally mediated by kinship, which gave rise in Dawkins' hands to the gene's eye view of evolution, which pictures genes as the ultimate beneficiaries of evolution, and suggests that phenomena such as altruism, although behavior may appear altruistic, it's really just genetic self-interest. That familiar line of argument from Dawkins' books in the 70s and early 80s. This was one part of the consensus against the hypothesis of group-level selection. The second part was the trenchant critique of group selection devised by the American evolutionist George Williams, who discussed a fallacy in this book, Adaptation and Natural Selection. Williams discussed a fallacy that he called the good of the group, or the good of the species fallacy, which he claimed was rampant in evolutionary theory at the time, even among experts on the theory, and which he wanted to expose and throw out of biology. And the good of the group fallacy is the fallacy involved in thinking that individual selection will automatically produce group beneficial arguments. And Williams maintained that, you see, I mean, there are many cases where individual selection leads ultimately, in the long run, to consequences that are detrimental for a whole group. So it's very common, for example, for animal groups to get selection to favor them to get better and more efficient at foraging for food, and then they overexploit their resource base and they go extinct. So it's clear that the long-term effect of natural selection operating on individuals need not be to benefit the whole group or any larger aggregate entity. So a consistent application of Darwinian principles must assume that the outcome of individual level selection operating on individuals, will be phenotypes and behaviors that are individually beneficial. And those may be incidentally beneficial to entities at higher levels of inclusiveness, but not automatically. And Williams maintained that in the biology of the day, there was an illegitimate appeal to group level advantage. So for example, the Nobel Prize winning ethologist Konrad Lorenz, in his work on aggression, famous book on aggression, discussed ritualistic fighting in animals. So Lorenz was interested in the phenomenon that in many animal species, such as deer, for example, which have got massive antlers, huge investment in fighting equipment, then the two male deer will often square up to each other and look as if they're about to have a fight. But then the weaker one somehow gives a signal, unclear quite how it does it, and then it backs down. And Lorenz was interested in the fact that they don't come to blows. The stronger one, though it could kill its rival or seriously wound it, doesn't do that. It sort of lets it off. So you see dogs doing the same thing all the time, right? And Lorenz was saying, well, what's advantageous about it? From the point of view of the stronger deer, why doesn't it press home its advantage and injure or kill its rival? I mean, they're competing for mates usually, right? And Lorenz argued, well, he said it would be disadvantageous for the species, right, if the males were to engage in such costly combat. And that's the Darwinian explanation. And Williams' observation, and he's absolutely correct about this, and modern enthusiasm for group-level selection shouldn't make us obscure this point. Williams' observation was that that's a fallacious pattern of reasoning. I mean, what you have to show, what Lorenz has to show, is what the advantage is to the individual deer, not to the species of which it's a whole. So, I mean, it's akin, Lorenz's reasoning there is akin to the reasoning you might, the following chain of reasoning. Suppose you're trying to explain why earthworms have physiology that enables them to burrow through the soil, right? And suppose a biologist says, well, here's the Darwinian explanation. By burrowing through the soil, they aerate the soil, and that benefits the local ecosystem because microbes come and live in it, and that benefits the plants. So it's beneficial for the local ecosystem. So that's the Darwinian explanation. It's clear that that isn't right. I mean, that can't be right, really. I mean, you've got to understand what the advantage is to the earthworm, right, in burrowing through the soil, not, to the local ecosystem of which it's a part, unless you're invoking a hypothesis of competition between conflicting ecosystems. So it's not that there's any fallacy involved in invoking the notion of group selection per se. Rather, the fallacy involved is assuming that selection at one level, on entities at one level, call them individuals, will necessarily produce outcomes that are beneficial to entities at some other level. I mean, that's the logical point. And I think is absolutely right. Williams is absolutely right on that point and still sometimes not fully appreciated. However, moving forward to about the mid-80s and still continuing today, we find a reassessment of this old consensus that group selection was no good, or didn't really make sense, or wasn't necessary, and the rise of what's sometimes called multi-level selection, which is in a way a return to Darwin, the quote from Darwin's Descent of Man, and is simply the idea that natural selection may operate at multiple hierarchical levels. And the motivation for this shift in view, this return to the idea that selection can operate up and down the hierarchy, is partly empirical and partly conceptual. I mean, partly there's the fact that not all social behavior is kin-directed. So if you think of symbiotic interactions between organisms of different species, then clearly there the hypothesis of kinship or of genetic relatedness isn't capable of explaining what's going on. And even within a species, I mean, empirical work has found, for example, in many insect colonies, that the relatedness is far less than what was originally believed to be the case. So the idea that you can dispense with the notion of group advantage and think purely in terms of relatedness and organisms helping their kin came under pressure empirically. And conceptually, many people came to realize that the opposition between the gene's eye view of thinking and the hypothesis of group-level selection is really a mistake, is a kind of category clash, in that the hypothesis of group-level selection is really just one way in which some genes can achieve advantage over their alleles. I mean, most genes achieve evolutionary advantage over their alleles, right, by affecting the individual organism of which the gene is part, but other genes do it differently. For example, by causing their individual organisms to exhibit a behavior that benefits the whole group. So there's not really any point contrasting the gene's eye view with group selection, a point that Dawkins came to acknowledge in his later work. And this, of course, raises the broader question, the philosophical question, of when we're dealing with hypotheses between which there's a matter of fact, and when we're dealing with alternative formulations of the same evolutionary hypothesis. And most fundamentally, then, it became clear that, I mean, the idea that individual selection is all that matters in practice couldn't really be the whole story, because the very entities that we call individuals are themselves groups of highly cooperating units. So if you think of an individual, a metazoan, a multicelled organism like ourselves, say, then clearly the cells within our bodies are highly cooperative subunits, all working together for the good of the whole. So from one perspective, you can think of an individual organism as a group of cells, and shifting further down, I mean, you can think of a eukaryotic cell as a cooperative group, right, containing a number of different chromosomes in the nucleus, containing organelles, such as mitochondria, outside the nucleus, all working together most of the time for the good of the whole. So what you count as an individual is, in a sense, individual doesn't really denote a fixed level in the hierarchy, but is an artifact of our perspective. This observation is closely bound up with the research program that Richard mentioned, that he works in, called Evolutionary Transitions in Individuality, which is the problem of trying to understand shifts in the level of individuality as some people will have it, or more precisely, trying to understand the following evolutionary phenomenon, which has occurred again and again in the history of life. We take a circumstance in which we have free-living individuals. Those individuals coalesce and form themselves into groups and become so integrated into the group that in effect the group becomes the new individual. And then we've got an increase in hierarchical complexity. And the individuals often give up their ability to survive and reproduce independently, and in the extreme cases just become parts of a larger whole that we typically then call the individual, yielding an increase in hierarchical complexity. And interestingly, this phenomenon, examples of which we'll talk about in a moment, almost invariably involves multi-level selection type ideas, in that there's potential during one of these transitions for selection to operate on the individuals within one of these coalescing groups and to operate on the aggregates themselves. So examples of such transitions, and here I draw on the work of John Maynard Smith and Seth Mary in their famous 1995 book. I mean, one of the earliest ones is the transition presumed to have happened between single replicators way back, in prebiotic evolution, very earliest days of life on Earth, where single replicators formed themselves into networks of replicators, probably because they could catalyze the replication of other ones. Much later, where we found individual genes physically forming themselves into chromosomes, so becoming joined up into a single whole. Much later again, we find prokaryotic or bacterial type cells forming themselves into eukaryotic cells. So if you recall, the basic theory for the evolution of the eukaryotic cell is that it was formed when one prokaryotic cell engulfed another one, probably parasitized it, and then eventually they formed a kind of symbiotic union. Then from single-celled eukaryotes to multi-celled organisms, happened a few hundred million years ago. Then from solitary free-living organisms to colonial organisms, and then possibly from tribes to modern human societies, I mean, question mark around this, because, I mean, arguably the level of integration pretty clearly hasn't been reached. So an interesting model system that many people have looked at to study the transition from single-cell to multi-celled organisms, the Volvocine colonies. These are blue-green algae that you'll find them, in any pond, if you know what to look for. They're an interesting model system because many species within this group, and they're all subtly different in terms of how integrated into groups they are. So if you look at a species called Gonium, these things are basically just free-living. The individual unit here is the individual algae, right? Single ones which form themselves into groups, right? But there isn't really any group functionality. They all retain the ability to survive and reproduce and to swim off. And they don't really interact much. They just live near each other, basically. At the other extreme, we find Volvox, species D, the favorite of many experimental biologists work on this sort of stuff, which exhibits a sort of germ-soma separation, some of the cells specializing in somatic function, others specializing in reproduction, and is basically a proto-multi-celled organism. And then the interesting question is, by what evolutionary steps did we get from A to D, to something like D? So the next installment then in this body of ideas is a theoretical contribution by a guy called George Price that I'm going to mention that interacts with this empirical stuff in an interesting way. This is a Price, rather eccentric looking chap. And what he devised working in the 1960s in London was a new formalism for thinking about multi-level selection. And that formalism, interestingly, although really is just an abstract mathematical language he developed, or model really that he developed, that doesn't have any sort of biological content on its own, but nonetheless was highly instrumental in persuading a lot of biologists that the hypothesis of group selection deserves a hearing after all. Rather unique in the life sciences that a purely theoretical contribution could change people's minds about some empirical issue. So I'll briefly describe what George Price did, how he achieved that in a moment. It was via a formalism that's become to be known as Price's equation, which is really an abstract formalism for describing any evolutionary system and applies very naturally where we've got conflicts between levels, where the evolutionary outcome is affected by selection at different levels. So Price's equation basically shows us how, in a multi-level scenario, how the strength of natural selection at each level, individual level and group level, for example, in a two-level scenario, can be compared, and how the overall evolutionary change can be expressed as the resultant of the two selective forces, as the sum of the contribution of selection at one level plus the contribution of selection at the other. And Price's key conceptual observation, very obvious when you have it pointed out, is that you can think of selection, you can capture it mathematically, simply as a covariance between some phenotypic character or genotypic character and fitness. So that really, in a way, just expresses what we mean by natural selection, right? I mean, if faster deer survive better than slower deer, then clearly we have a covariance, a positive correlation between running speed and reproductive success, reproductive fitness. And so Price's suggestion was that we should take this to be an operational definition, if you like, of the notion of natural selection. And then, that in itself is a kind of obvious and, in a sense, just true by definition. But what isn't as obvious or as true by definition is that the total evolutionary change can be expressed as the sum of the covariances at the different levels in the way that I'll illustrate in a moment, in a multi-level scenario. So think again of this scenario that we abstracted from Darwin's discussion in The Descent of Man, right? Where we've got our groups, the big green things, the tribes or groups competing with each other, and the individuals within a tribe potentially competing with each other too. And we observed that within any one group, the yellow ones are an advantage. Between groups, then groups that have more red ones are at an advantage. And then we're interested, let's say, in the overall change in the relative proportions of the two types over time. So let's focus on the change in the proportion of the altruistic types from one generation to another. What Price showed then is that the total evolutionary change, so in that example, the change in the proportion of red dots from generation 1 to generation 2, can be expressed as follows. The sum of a component attributable to group selection and a component attributable, he argued, to individual selection, where these two components are as follows. The group selection component is the covariance between the fitness of a group, meaning the total number of dots of offspring that it leaves, and the character of the group, which here in that example means the proportion of red dots within it. Mm-hmm. Right, so if ones with a high proportion of red dots, groups like that, leave more offspring than ones like that with a high proportion of yellow dots, then there's a positive covariance between the character proportion of red dots and the fitness of a group. Mm-hmm. That's the group selection component. And the individual selection component, which is the average across all the groups of the within-group covariance between individual fitness and individual character. So to calculate that, again, in this example, look at any one of the groups, like that one there, for example, and observe that there's a correlation, or in this case, a negative covariance between being altruistic and your level of fitness. So within this group, or within each of the groups, there's going to be a negative correlation between being a red dot and your evolutionary fitness, because the red ones do worse. They're altruistic within the group. Take the average across all the groups, add it to the group selection component, and what Price showed is you always get the total evolutionary change. I mean, it's just true by the definition of the terms. I mean, in a sense, it's just a mathematical tautology. But it's conceptually very interesting. And one aspect of its interest is that if you observe the expression inside the average operator here, down at the bottom, the covariance between individual fitness and individual character, has the same form as this first term here. And that's the formal expression of the fact that essentially the same process of natural selection is going on up and down the hierarchy. Some individuals doing better than other individuals, some groups doing better than other groups. And in any case, because of this very versatile formalism, that convinced a lot of people that the hypothesis of group selection makes good logical sense after all. But in fact, I'll argue that some subtleties have got ignored in the change in biological opinion as a result of that formalism. So with that little spiel, I've described sort of the history of social evolution theory from about the 1960s up to the present. Now many people, I mean, a quite common view is that thanks to all the work of many of those people I mentioned, we've got a good understanding of how natural selection works in social scenarios, in hierarchical, these structured biological populations. And so really the outstanding issues are simply empirical. We now just need to understand how common multi-level selection is, how it works empirically. But what I want to argue is that in fact it's not so simple, and that there are underlying philosophical issues in that biological body of biological theory that aren't very well understood yet. Some of these concern causality, reduction, and emergence. We'll talk about those. Others concern the opposition between realism and the philosophical view called conventionalism. So this is the question of whether there's always a sort of fact of the matter at stake between these competing evolutionary hypotheses, or whether sometimes the choice between them is in fact a matter of convention. This is an old opposition in the philosophy of the physical sciences that finds natural instances here too. And thirdly, links to political and social philosophy that this body of theory has. And in the remaining time, I'll talk briefly about points 1 and 3, leaving 2 for now. Okay, so causality. Now, it's a familiar observation that Darwinian explanations are causal. When you give a Darwinian explanation of the prevalence of some trait in a species, say in a population, then you take that to be a causal explanation of how it came to be there. Mm-hmm. That causal dimension is often left out of the formalisms that we use to describe evolution. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, that is clearly meant to be part of, an essential part of the story. The notion of selection for, here I draw on the work of the philosopher Elliot Sober, is a causal notion. So Sober's observation was that you can contrast two senses of the notion of the expression natural selection. In one sense, when you say something was selected, all you mean is that in fact it came to predominate in a population. But in another sense, so when you say, for example, there was selection for running speed in this zebra population, you don't just mean that running speed increased over time, you mean that it's because it was advantageous, it increased over time. So selection for and the correlative notion of adaptation clearly are causal notions. And so then, once that point is made, we can make a distinction between characters that causally affect fitness, right, and ones that correlate with fitness for some other reason. Just the familiar observation that causation and correlation are different, applied to natural selection. And this distinction is sometimes marked by evolutionists by using the language of direct selection versus indirect selection. So a character subject to direct selection causally affects survival and reproduction. One that's indirectly selected has no causal effect, but correlates with survival and reproduction for some other reason. Perhaps because it's genetically linked to some other character that's directly selected. So we can apply that familiar point at multiple levels, and here things in a hierarchical system, and here things get a little bit more complicated. I mean, at a single level, then the issue is fairly conceptually clear, and very well-known statistical techniques many of you will know about can be used to help distinguish causation from correlation. But at multiple levels, it gets a little bit more complicated because we have to take into account a new possibility that a correlation between character, that means genotypic or phenotypic character, and fitness at level X, for example, the group level, may be a side effect of direct selection at a lower down level. Mm. And in that circumstance, then we have what I have referred to in my work as a cross-level byproduct. So in that circumstance, the causality is all down at the lower level. And a side effect of that is that we have a positive association, positive correlation between a character and fitness at the higher level. And this possibility immediately frustrates, as I see it, the attempt to read the answer to the levels of selection in any empirical case off the formalism of the price equation. So examples, so here's schematically what I mean by a cross-level byproduct. In a hierarchically structured biological system, where the lower level characters, those are properties of individuals, causally determine, that's the big arrow, the lower level fitnesses. Then the individual characters determine the character of the group of which they're in, by that. And similarly, the fitnesses of the individuals determine the group fitness, and as a result, we find a correlation, but not directly a causal link between the character of the group and the fitness of the group. So examples of this then. I mean, think of selection on a non-social trait in a multi-group population. Imagine that selection is for height or something in a population of organisms that happen to live in groups. And imagine that an organism's height only affects its own biological fitness, not that of anyone else, as is plausibly the case, right? Nonetheless, you may well find, if it so happens that some groups contain taller individuals than others, that group, the average fitness in that group, will be greater than the average fitness in a group containing predominantly less tall organisms. Mm-hmm. But clearly, that's just a side effect of natural selection operating on the individual character. It would be quite wrong to multiply levels of selection in that scenario, because there you have what I call a cross-level byproduct. Or think of the so-called species selection concept in macroevolution that Stephen Jay Gould was so fond of. This is the idea that some species go extinct or split faster than other species at different rates, depending on their characters. But typically, that's just a side effect of the selective interactions operating at the lower level. You know, so if red squirrels are driven extinct by gray squirrels, right, then clearly, I mean, one species ends up going extinct and the other doesn't. So one group prospers and the other doesn't. And there's a difference between those groups. One is composed of gray squirrels, the other of red squirrels. But you don't, on account of that, want to posit a process of natural selection operating at the species level. Plausibly, all that's happened is individual interactions between red and gray squirrels have meant that, as a side effect, we have this correlation at the group level, but it's not directly causal. And think again of the Volvox colonies. That's essentially what's going on in something like A. You may find that some groups of these, of goniums, do better than other groups, and that may be associated, there may be significant differences between the two sorts of groups. But you see, that's arguably just going to be a side effect of the fact that some of the individual algae, single cells, are better than, do better for intrinsically better adapted than other ones. So the group effect will be a side effect of the causality happening at the individual level. And so this then raises a key issue that I claim has been neglected in a lot of the biological literature on this, which is the following. Now, the question then, as I see it, is this: what's required for a character fitness covariance at a given level to be due to causal processes at that level, as opposed to being a side effect of causal processes at some other level? Intuitively, what you want is sort of autonomy from lower level processes. But how to characterize this, I think, is a tricky philosophical issue. And I claim that this question is, in effect, the problem that's always been at the heart of the levels of selection controversy in biology, although not expressed in quite those terms usually. One interesting suggestion is that emergent properties have something to do with it. And another suggestion is that this autonomy is never really possible. And here I describe a line of argument rarely made explicit, but in the background of a lot of biological discussions, that I call the supervenience argument. This is a term of art from metaphysics, a branch of philosophy. Basically means depend. Supervene means depend on, in effect. Now, plausibly enough, the phenotypic character of a group and its fitness always supervene depend on individual characters and individual fitness. So it's tempting to infer from that the causation is always going to be at the lower level. So this looks like a kind of argument for reductionism, which then leads naturally to the thought that autonomous higher level selection is impossible. So in other words, that the causation is always from below. So in other words, that it's impossible that there could be a direct causal link between the properties of the groups and their fitness, because ultimately it'll always be due to lower level stuff, because the group properties always depend on the lower level ones. And so the causality at the higher level is always a mirage, if you like. That's a line of argument found in this area, found in very many other areas where similar issues arise, found in discussions of the mind-body problem in philosophy, for example, the problem of understanding how mental states can cause behavior, like beliefs and desires, when presumably mental states like beliefs and desires depend on brain states, right? So many philosophers have tried to argue, well, it's impossible. The brain state is really causing the behavior, for using an argument akin to this. And at this juncture in the argument, it's very natural to draw on what's sometimes called emergent properties, and to make the suggestion that, look, in some groups, then the group characters may be emergent with respect to the lower level, and in others they're not. The contrast with emergent is sometimes, the expression used is sometimes aggregate. So think, for example, of certain insect colonies versus certain mammalian groups. So here we have a honeybee colony, versus a baboon troop. Now, I mean, clearly you can talk about properties of the baboon troop. You can talk about its size, the total body mass of the baboons in it, other properties of it, and they're clearly well-defined empirical properties. But in a real sense, they're just sort of aggregates of individuals. Say the total body mass of the baboons in the troop. Yeah, clearly that's a property of the whole troop, not of any individual baboon. But nonetheless, it's determined so directly by the properties of the individual baboons that it's tempting to say, look, it's not really a property of the whole group. At least it's not a property of the group in the sense that, say, the division of labor among the different castes or different morphs within the honeybee colony, or the extent of morphological differentiation between the workers and the queen in a honeybee colony, right, is that that's a property of the whole thing, right, not of any individual. So that's the emergent aggregate contrast. Intuitive, in fact, is very hard to make precise. However, I want to maintain that, in fact, this distinction, contra a lot of people, is irrelevant to the problem at hand. And we see that when we make the distinction between lower-level selection doing the real causal work and some lower-level processes or other doing the causal work. And I claim that in the context of this thinking about levels of selection, thinking about whether the individual is the adapted unit or the group, one is really what matters, not two. And indeed, on plausible metaphysical assumptions, two is always going to be the case. I mean, presumably you can always argue that the properties of wholes are determined ultimately by the properties of their constituents. So you can always argue that ultimately there's some lower level explanation of what's going on. But the interesting idea is that there's a lower level selective explanation of the covariance between the group character and the group fitness. And that's what I maintain is not always the case. And once you make that distinction, the motivation for invoking the notion of emergent property to finesse this issue about the autonomy of higher level selection from lower level selection is removed. So that's an argument I've made that I'd be happy to elaborate on if anyone wants. So changing tack for the last part of the talk, just a few minutes on this very interesting topic. In these social scenarios that I've been talking about, there's often a trade-off between individual and group interests, and they're potentially in conflict. What's individually advantageous may be bad for the group. What will be best for the group is something that no individual would choose to do, because it wouldn't be the best for them. So the action of self-interested agents, to use economic language, may not maximize collective welfare. And of course, this is a central theme in political philosophy as well as in social evolution. And in the context of the evolutionary transitions problem, the question we face is how individual and group interests can be reconciled. Because you see, it must be possible to reconcile them, because such reconciliation has happened repeatedly in evolution. I mean, if it hadn't, we wouldn't be here, right? Because a group, requires, say, a multicelled organism, requires enormous cooperation between the individual cells. It's crucial that the cells aren't just going about their own thing. When that happens, we get, cancer and its consequences. So in this literature on evolutionary transitions of individuality, we find extensive discussion of mechanisms by which individual interest and group interest, which are potentially in conflict, can be brought into alignment, thus permitting group selection to sort of trump individual selection. And how can that be achieved? Well, one way is just clonality or relatedness. So if the individuals are clonal or highly related, at least, within a group, then their evolutionary interests are more closely aligned. The second mechanism is division of labor, going about different tasks, specializing in different tasks, so you need each other. Thirdly, we find policing of selfish behavior, as in the immune system, the vertebrate immune system, for example, or something that happens in a lot of insect colonies too. Workers who try and reproduce rather than doing their job, other ones will coerce them, will eat the eggs they lay or kill their offspring. And then fourthly, and interestingly, this is what I'm going to talk about, we find randomization as a way of aligning individual and group interests. I mean, to see how that works then, suppose you're in a lifeboat, for example, right, and you know that you all get together and you decide that after 12 hours, right, it's hopeless because, after 12 hours, 5 people are going to have to be thrown overboard. Then, because otherwise you're all going to die. Now, but in the first, up until that point, at which some people are going to have to be thrown over, you want everyone to work together, to row, and to work together to try and get rescued. But clearly people's interests aren't aligned, and that 5 of you are going to be thrown overboard, right, after a few hours. But how do you design a system to get everybody to cooperate for the original period before anyone's going to be thrown overboard? Well, the obvious mechanism is you randomize, right? So you choose those 5 people at random at the end of the first 12-hour period to be thrown overboard. And then in that first 12-hour period, we find everyone's interests are aligned. And this idea corresponds to a famous argument in political philosophy associated with the philosopher John Rawls in his famous book, The Theory of Justice from 1970s, in which he described what he called the original position, which is a hypothetical thought experiment designed to probe our intuitions about what a just allocation or fair allocation of society's resources are. You'll see how it ties in with the biology in a moment. So in the original position, you have to decide on society's allocation of resources to individuals without knowing which individual you're going to be. So you're behind what Rawls calls a veil of ignorance, an argument also made by the economist John Harsanyi before him in the 50s. So the idea then is that someone says to you, look, okay, decide how you want society's resources to be divided up among the different people in society, right? But you don't know who you're going to be. You don't know if you're going to be the rich guy or the poor guy or what. Mm-hmm. So then how would you choose in ignorance of of your identity, of which individual you're going to be? And Rawls maintained that the choice you would make is or that everyone would make, he maintained, is the just choice. You've got an equal chance of being any individual in this thought experiment. And Rawls famously argued that the rational thing to do was to maximize the welfare of the least well-off person, in case you to be highly risk-averse, in case you were going to be that person. And maintained rather implausibly that canons of rational choice dictated that. I mean, rather implausibly because you see they don't, really, which is a great embarrassment for this theory, but Rawls didn't know that. Harsanyi made a rather more sophisticated axiomatic argument for the utilitarian solution, for choosing from behind the veil of ignorance the allocation of resources that maximizes welfare in toto without regard for distributional issues. Mm-hmm. But for more sophisticated reasons, that doesn't work. So although their arguments are implausible, their underlying point is a deep one, that randomization is a way of aligning the conflicting interests of people. And we find this hypothetical experiment exactly played out in the reproductive systems of modern diploid organisms. The genes in an organism usually work for the good of it, so that's roughly to maximize the organism's gametic output. But of course, as we all know, in a sexual species, only half the genes are passed into each gamete. And that creates the potential for conflict, which is realized in almost all sexually reproducing species. There's a potential conflict in that any individual gene has only got a half chance of making it into any particular gamete and therefore offspring of its host organism. And if it can do anything to bias, to distort the fairness of the meiotic process, which determines the equal chances, then it will do so. So here we see meiosis. So the first multiplication has happened here already, and we find 4 haploid gametes formed from the diploid starting point. So then we face the question, well, what aligns the interests of the gene and the whole genome, right? We don't have clonality in this case. The whole point is the gamete is not a clone of the diploid cell from which it came. It only contains half the chromosome number. Well, the answer is randomization, that each gene has an equal 50% chance of transmission to each gamete. So that means that a gene can't do better than work for the collective good, right? Help to build a strong body and a liver and a functioning immune system, even though it's only, may not be in the offspring. It may not benefit from that because a randomization has determined that basically its identity has been randomized away. So what that shows is that the Rawls-Harsanyi thought experiment is actually, in a way, put into practice by evolution and confirms their general idea. It's interesting then to consider, this is something I've worked on a bit recently, what become of their putative solutions in the light of evolution. Okay, so then wrapping up, what I've been trying to argue is that social evolution theory is in fact, although a well-established body of science, requires philosophical scrutiny in that when you press the concepts, philosophical problems arise. That's what I was trying to illustrate with my discussion of causation, etc. But then I think that conversely, the body of theory offers new insights into many traditional problems in social and political philosophy. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.